They told her she had a face only a mother could love, after a car fire. But they never imagined the truth behind her scars, or the army she was about to command without saying a single word. The morning sun, weak and hazy, filtered through the greasy windows of the Daily Grind diner, illuminating swirling dust motes in its pale yellow beams. The air was thick with the comforting trinity of American breakfast, the sizzle of bacon, the bitter aroma of brewing coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of stale pancake syrup that clung to the vinyl booths. It was a place of routine, a refuge for early risers and third-shift workers, where the clatter of ceramic on formica was the prevailing soundtrack. Navigating this familiar landscape was Elara Vance. At 40, she moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving. There were no wasted steps, no fumbled gestures. When she picked up a coffee pot, her grip was precise. When she wiped a counter, the motion was a single, clean arc. Her uniform, a faded blue dress with a white apron, was impeccably clean but worn thin at the elbows and seams. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, tight bun, as if to keep any stray strands from defying her control. But it was her face that drew the eye. A network of pale, jagged scars mapped the landscape of her left cheek, from the corner of her eye down to her jawline. The skin was puckered and uneven, a permanent testament to a history she never spoke of. Most of the regulars had long ago learned to look past it, to see only the quiet, efficient waitress who remembered if you took cream or sugar. The bell above the door chimed, announcing an intrusion rather than an arrival. Two men in their early 30s swaggered in, their voices loud and slick with the unearned confidence of corporate sales reps. They wore matching fleece vests emblazoned with the logo of some impenetrable tech startup, Synervo. They surveyed the humble diner with the amused disdain of zoo patrons observing a lesser species. They slid into a corner booth, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the quiet space. Elara approached, a notepad in her hand, her expression neutral. "Morning. Know what you'd like?" Her voice was low, level. The one with the aggressively styled hair, who she would later learn was Chad, looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her scars with theatrical curiosity. "Whoa there. Let's see. What's the special today? A fistful of angry bees?" His companion, Kyle, snorted. "I don't know, Chad. Looks like the kitchen's already got a pretty hot temper." Elara's posture didn't change. She simply stood, her pen poised over the paper, her gaze fixed on a point just over Chad's shoulder. This was a practiced defense, a retreat into a place within herself where their words were just noise, like the hum of the ancient refrigerator. She had built this fortress brick by brick over 5 long years. "We have a Western omelet." "Or pancakes," she stated, her tone flat. Her refusal to engage, to show even a flicker of hurt, seemed to inflame them. They wanted a reaction, a tear, a crack in the porcelain calm. It was a power play, and she was denying them their victory. Chad leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet deliberately loud, whisper. "Seriously, though. You gotta tell us." He gestured to her face. "What happened there? Did you try to kiss a moving truck?" The scattered conversations in the diner faltered and died. The sizzle of the grill suddenly seemed deafening. Every eye in the room, from the construction worker at the counter to the elderly couple by the window, darted toward their booth. Elara was no longer a waitress, she was an exhibit, pinned by the spotlight of their cruelty. The blood roared in her ears, a familiar, rushing tide. Her throat constricted. For a terrifying second, the walls of her inner fortress trembled. But she held. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the air scraping past the lump in her throat. She set their menus down with a steady hand. "Pancakes," she said, her voice a ghost of its former self. "I'll be back with your coffee." As she turned to leave, Kyle delivered the final, resonant blow, ensuring the whole room could appreciate his wit. "Hey, be careful with that coffee pot," he called after her. "Wouldn't want you to have another accident." Chad howled with laughter. It was a sharp, ugly sound that struck Elara's back like a physical slap. she did not flinch. She just kept walking, each step a monumental effort of will, carrying the weight of every stare in the room. Elara reached the sanctuary of the service counter, her back to the room. She placed the coffee pot down, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She could feel their eyes on her, could feel the pity from some and the morbid curiosity from others. It was a familiar, suffocating cloak. Her body was present, in the Daily Grind diner in Cleveland, Ohio, but her mind was 6,000 miles and 5 years away, lost in a storm of dust and fire. The smell of brewing coffee was replaced by the acrid stench of burning diesel and scorched metal. The clatter of dishes became the deafening roar of an explosion, followed by the high-pitched ringing in her ears that never truly went away. She wasn't Elara Vance, 40-year-old waitress. She was Doc Vance, a combat medic with the United States Army, her hands slick with sweat and someone else's blood. The flashback hit with the force of a physical impact. Ramadi, Iraq. A narrow, sun-baked alleyway that always felt like a trap. Her unit, Valkyrie 7, was on patrol. They were a specialized medical evacuation team, their job to run toward the very chaos everyone else was trained to run from. The IED had ripped through the lead Humvee. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of brown smoke, orange flame, and the shrapnel-laced screams of her men. Her training took over, a cold, sharp instrument in the heart of chaos. While others sought cover, she ran forward, her medical pack bouncing against her spine. She remembered pulling a screaming sergeant from the wreckage, his leg a mangled ruin. She remembered applying a tourniquet with practiced, desperate speed. She remembered shouting orders, her voice raw, directing the other able-bodied soldiers to establish a perimeter. She was in her element, a goddess of triage in a kingdom of pain. She had gotten 3 of them clear. But the 4th, a fresh-faced private named Miller, barely 20 and still with a picture of his high school girlfriend taped to his helmet, was pinned inside the burning vehicle. The flames were a living thing, a roaring, hungry beast. "Doc! Get back! It's gonna cook off," someone had screamed. But she couldn't. She had reached into the inferno, her hands searing against the hot metal, trying to free his leg. The fire licked at her uniform, at her exposed skin. She could feel her cheek beginning to blister and peel. Miller had looked at her, his eyes wide with a terror that would be imprinted on her soul forever. "It's okay, son," she had lied, her voice cracking. "I've got you. I'm not leaving you." Then the vehicle's fuel tank had erupted. The blast threw her backward, a rag doll in a hurricane of force. The last thing she saw was the fire consuming the space where Miller had been. The last thing she heard was her own promise, echoing in the flames, "I'm not leaving you." She woke up in a hospital in Landstuhl, Germany, a part of her left behind in that alley forever. They gave her medals for her bravery, for the 3 men she saved. But all she felt was the searing ghost of the one she had lost. The scars on her face were a physical manifestation of her failure, a daily reminder of her broken promise. A cup clattered onto a saucer nearby, snapping her back to the present. She blinked, the diner slowly swimming back into focus. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs. From his booth by the window, Arthur Pendleton watched her. He was a man in his late 70s, with a face as weathered as old leather and hands that, despite their age spots, still looked strong enough to field strip a rifle. He was a Marine, Vietnam-era force recon, though he never spoke of it. He came to the diner every morning for the coffee and the quiet. Today, there was no quiet. He had seen the whole exchange. He'd seen the casual cruelty of the 2 young men and the waitress's incredible, silent fortitude. It was a strength he recognized. It was the armor of a survivor. He had watched her turn, the way she held her shoulders rigid, and it was in that moment, as she moved under the fluorescent lights, that his old, sharp eyes caught it. Just below the rolled-up sleeve of her left arm, on the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a small, faded tattoo. It was a stylized V with a 7 nested inside it. A single, elegant wing swept out from one side of the V, and entwined around the other was the rod of Asclepius, the serpent and staff of medicine. Arthur's breath caught in his chest. His coffee grew cold in his hands. Valkyrie, 7. He hadn't seen that mark in the wild for a very, very long time. Arthur Pendleton stared at the tattoo, and the years fell away. Valkyrie, 7 wasn't just a unit designation, it was a legend, whispered about in VFW halls and online forums for veterans. They were ghosts, the medics who went where even the Green Berets hesitated. They operated under a veil of operational security, their heroics buried in classified after-action reports. But stories leaked. Stories of medics who held the line, who became warriors when they had to, who had a reputation for impossible saves and a casualty rate that was terrifyingly high. To see that mark on the wrist of a waitress in a Cleveland diner was like finding a priceless, forgotten artifact in a pawn shop. A wave of profound, fierce respect washed over him. He knew what it took to earn a mark like that. He knew the cost. The scars on her face suddenly reconfigured in his mind. They were no longer signs of a random tragedy. They were a decoration. A medal of flesh and blood that put any ribbon worn on a uniform to shame. His gaze shifted to Chad and Kyle, who were now loudly complaining about the slow service, oblivious to the history standing 20 feet away from them. A cold, hard anger began to smolder in Arthur's gut. It was an old, familiar anger, one he hadn't felt in decades. It was the rage of a man who had seen real sacrifice being mocked by blissful ignorance. He debated what to do. Step in. Make a scene. No, that wasn't the way. A soldier like her wouldn't want a scene. She wouldn't want a pity party. She would want the quiet dignity she was so clearly fighting to maintain. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Elara emerged from behind the counter, a fresh pot of coffee in her hand, her face set in a mask of professional neutrality. She had to walk past their booth to get to another table. As she did, Kyle, annoyed by her continued silence, made a petulant, childish move. He stretched his leg out into the aisle. He didn't kick her, not quite. He just created an obstacle, a lazy, arrogant barrier. Elara's foot caught his ankle. She stumbled, her balance, usually so perfect, momentarily lost. The coffee pot tipped violently in her hand. A stream of scalding black liquid poured out, splashing directly onto her left wrist, onto the very tattoo Arthur had been studying. She let out a small, sharp gasp of pain, pulling her hand back. The fabric of her sleeve was instantly soaked, clinging to the reddening skin beneath. The pot clattered to the floor, spilling the rest of its contents in a dark, spreading pool. Chad threw his head back and laughed, a braying, triumphant sound. "Careful, hero," he jeered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't lose another battle." That was it. The word. Hero. Used as a weapon. Used as an insult. That was the line. The dam of Arthur's restraint broke. This was no longer about disrespect. This was a desecration. With a slow, deliberate movement, Arthur reached into his jacket pocket. He ignored his modern smartphone and pulled out a relic, a ruggedized, beat-up flip phone that had served him for over a decade. He flipped it open with a flick of his thumb. His fingers, large and stiff with age, moved with surprising speed over the keypad. He navigated to a contact group he hadn't opened in years, a group simply labeled, The Regiment. He typed out a short, simple message, a modern-day call to arms coded in the language of their shared past. Valkyrie, 7 is here. The Daily Grind Diner. Hostiles present. Reinforcements needed. His thumb hovered over the descent button. He looked at Elara, who was now on her knees, trying to clean up the mess, her face hidden, her shoulders trembling slightly. He looked at the two men in the booth, smirking at the mess they had created. He pressed send. The message flew out into the ether, a digital flare shot into the sky, waiting for a response from the scattered, sleeping army. After the message was sent, a profound stillness seemed to settle over Arthur's booth. He put the phone away and picked up his cold coffee, taking a slow sip as if nothing had happened. But inside, he was a watchman on the wall, scanning the horizon. The next few minutes stretched into an eternity. Elara, having cleaned up the spilled coffee with trembling hands, had retreated to the back, likely to the kitchen, out of sight. The diner's owner, a kindly woman named Martha, shot a venomous glare at Chad and Kyle's booth before disappearing into the back as well, probably to check on Elara. Chad and Kyle, basking in the aftermath of their perceived victory, were oblivious. They resumed their loud conversation, this time about some sales conference in Las Vegas. Their voices were a profane intrusion into the tense silence that had enveloped the rest of the diner. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably, some staring openly at the two men with undisguised contempt. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken judgment. Then, the bell over the door chimed. A man in a crisp, dark business suit entered. He held a leather briefcase and looked like he had just stepped out of a downtown law office. He paused just inside the door, his sharp eyes sweeping the room in a single, practiced motion that took less than a second. He wasn't looking for a menu or a free table. He was assessing. His gaze met Arthur's for a fleeting instant, and a nearly imperceptible nod was exchanged. The man then walked calmly to the counter and took a seat, ordering a black coffee without looking at the menu. 2 minutes later, the bell chimed again. A young woman pushed a stroller through the door. She looked like any other suburban mom, yoga pants, a messy bun, a diaper bag slung over her shoulder. But she didn't coo at her baby or fuss with its blanket. She parked the stroller near the entrance, her movements efficient and calm, and scanned the room with the same quiet intensity as the lawyer. She took a small table by the wall, her back to it, giving her a clear view of the entire diner. The bell chimed again. And again. And again. A man in a grease-stained plumber's uniform came in, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded to the lawyer and took a stool at the counter. A woman in her late 40s, wearing a full set of motorcycle leathers and carrying her helmet under her arm, entered next. She let the door swing shut behind her and leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. Her eyes, cold and steady, locked onto Chad and Kyle's booth. A college kid with a backpack. An elderly man who looked like a retired professor. A woman in nurse's scrubs, clearly on her way to or from a shift. They filtered in, one by one, a silent, steady stream of seemingly random people. They came from every walk of life, a cross-section of the city itself. Yet they all shared something, a certain way of carrying themselves, a quiet confidence, an unmistakable stillness that set them apart from the other customers. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't need to. They were nodes in a network, connected by an invisible thread of shared experience. The atmosphere in the diner began to change. The air crackled with a low-voltage energy. Chad and Kyle's boisterous conversation faltered. Chad looked up, noticing the sheer number of people who had come in, none of whom were eating. "Geez, this place get popular all of a sudden," he muttered to Kyle, trying for a joke, but his voice was thin. Kyle didn't answer. He was staring at the biker woman, who was staring right back at him, her expression utterly flat, utterly devoid of emotion. He shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling exposed. The diner, once their stage, had become a cage. The silent audience was no longer passive, they were predators, and he and Chad were the prey. The room was full, but completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, shallow breathing of two men who had just realized they had made a catastrophic mistake. The final chime of the doorbell cut through the electric silence. The conversations, the pretense, everything stopped. The woman who entered moved with a purpose that commanded the room's entire attention. She was in her late 60s, with a cascade of silver hair pulled into an elegant twist. She wore a simple, well-tailored pantsuit, but she leaned heavily on a modern carbon fiber cane. As she walked past the window, a beam of sunlight illuminated a thin, white scar that traced a delicate line along her own cheekbone. She was Colonel Eva Rostova, retired, a name that still carried immense weight in certain circles. She walked directly to the service counter where Elara had just re-emerged from the kitchen, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Elara was trying to busy herself by polishing the silverware, her movements now jerky and uncertain. Eva Rostova stopped in front of her, ignoring Chad and Kyle, ignoring Arthur, ignoring everyone. She looked at Elara, her gaze both stern and filled with a profound, aching gentleness. From a pocket inside her blazer, she produced a perfectly folded American flag, the triangle of star-spangled blue on top. She laid it gently on the counter between them. "This is from Captain Marcus Thorne," Eva said, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the silent room. "It was the flag that draped his casket. His mother wanted you to have it." Elara stared at the flag, her breath catching in a choked sob. "Thorne. Her captain. He made me promise, if he didn't make it, that I would find you," Eva continued softly. "His last words weren't about the battle, or about the pain. They were about you, Vance." Eva leaned in closer. "He said, tell Doc Vance she did it. Tell her she carried us all home." The fortress Elara had built around her heart for 5 years shattered into a million pieces. The tears she had refused to shed, the grief she had buried alive, erupted to the surface. I failed him," she whispered, the words a raw, ragged confession of her deepest shame. I couldn't save him. I left him behind." It was then that Arthur Pendleton stood up. He turned not to Elara, but to the entire room, his voice ringing with the authority of a man long accustomed to command. His eyes, however, were fixed on the two pale, shrinking figures in the corner booth. "You see scars," he boomed, his voice like gravel and steel. "We see a battlefield survived. You see a flaw, a mistake, something to be laughed at. We see proof that when the worst thing imaginable happened, she lived." He took a step forward. "You see a waitress. You pour your mockery on her like she's nothing. But we see a warrior who ran into fire that would have made you cry for your mothers. We see a hero who never, not for 1 second, needed your permission to be one." He let the words hang in the air, heavy as gravestones. "Real heroes don't have to be perfect," he said, his voice dropping but losing none of its power. "They just have to come home." Chad and Kyle were the color of ash. There was nowhere to hide from the dozens of pairs of eyes that were now boring into them. Eyes that held no anger, no overt threat, just a vast, cold, bottomless contempt. It was the judgment of an entire generation of warriors. With fumbling, clumsy movements, Chad threw a handful of bills onto the table. They scrambled out of the booth, heads down, and practically ran from the diner, pushing past the silent figures who parted just enough to let them through. The door chimed their shameful exit. The tension in the room broke, replaced by something else. Something quiet and sacred. One by one, the veterans approached the counter. The lawyer in the suit took a small, heavy coin from his pocket, a challenge coin from the 75th Ranger Regiment, and placed it silently on the counter next to the flag. The biker woman slid a worn leather patch from her jacket, bearing the insignia of a Marine Air Wing, and laid it down. The plumber added a small, folded ribbon bar. The young mother, a unit crest pin. The nurse, a simple commemorative bracelet. A small mountain of honor, of shared history and silent understanding, grew on the Formica counter in front of Elara. No words were spoken. None were needed. They were honoring one of their own, welcoming a lost soldier home. They left as quietly as they had arrived. The bell chimed a soft farewell for each departing soldier, until only Elara, Arthur, and the diner's owner, Martha, remained. The pile of tokens on the counter shimmered under the fluorescent lights, a constellation of bronze, silver, and colorful enamel. A silent, stunning tribute. Elara reached out a trembling hand and traced the edge of the folded flag. For the first time in 5 years, the roaring in her ears was gone. The ghosts of Ramadi were quiet. A fragile peace, like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night, began to settle in her soul. She looked up and caught her reflection in the polished chrome of the coffee machine. She saw the scars. But for the first time, she didn't see failure. She saw the face of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side. She saw the face of Doc Vance, the woman who had saved 3 men. The woman Captain Thorne had called a hero. She stood a little taller, her shoulders straightening not with tension, but with a newfound, fragile grace. Martha, a woman whose kindness had been a small, steady light in Elara's life, came over and wrapped her in a gentle hug. "I'm so proud of you, honey," she whispered, and Elara finally let herself lean into the embrace, the warmth a welcome anchor. The story did not end there. It rippled outward. A few days later, Arthur Pendleton, sitting in his quiet apartment, logged onto a private Facebook group for veterans of the post-9/11 conflicts. He typed out the story of what had happened at the Daily Grind diner. He used no real names and kept the location vague, simply titling his post, "A Valkyrie Gets Her Wings Back." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The post was shared thousands of times. The comments section exploded, not with anger, but with recognition. A former Navy SEAL from San Diego wrote, "I see my brothers and sisters working checkout lines and stocking shelves. They're the quietest people in the room, but their eyes see everything." A retired Air Force pilot from Texas added, "Respect is the cheapest, most valuable thing you can give someone. Thank you for reminding them." The post became a digital monument. People began sharing their own stories of encounters with silent heroes, the unassuming mechanic who had a silver star in a dusty box, the librarian who had been a codebreaker, the janitor who had patched up wounded soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam. The story of the waitress with the scars became a parable, a reminder that the person pouring your coffee might have carried a burden you could never imagine. It was a testament to the fact that the longest, hardest battles are often fought not on a foreign battlefield, but in the quiet landscape of a warrior's own heart, long after the guns have fallen silent. Elara's story, though anonymous, became a beacon. It reminded thousands that heroes don't just fade away, they integrate. They become the fabric of the nation they fought to protect, carrying their history etched not just on their skin, but in the quiet, steady beat of their resilient hearts. Elara's story reminds us that heroes walk among us, often in plain sight. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever witnessed an act of quiet courage? Share your story in the comments below. Please remember to comment with respect for everyone's experience. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe and share this video to honor the silent warriors everywhere.